Welcome to Code Project Car here on Engines and Idiots. My name is SN and this is my 2006 CLS55 AMG build. What I want to document in this series is the mods we do on this car to get it to about 650-ish horsepower at the crank. I want to keep this cosmetically looking like an OEM plus car, but I want to amplify its already incredible power and driving experience. The CLS55 was available for 1 year in 2006 and is based off its cousin, the E55 AMG. Bone stock, these cars made about 469 horsepower and 516 foot-pound torque, although there are some people who will tell you that 469 horsepower was a marketing gimmick to not let this and the E55 outshine the more expensive models with the M113K engine, and that it may be making as close as 493 horsepower at the crank. This series is hopefully going to cover how I get this car from those numbers closer to 650. So make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, as there will be more episodes following this one. So to start off, let's take a look at suspension. When I first bought this car, I had every intention to keep the air suspension, but on day 3 the driver's side front air shock failed, and when pulling it in the garage the other side lost pressure, and the fender landed on the wheel and bent it out. Finding air shocks with COVID proved a bit difficult, so I just opted to make the switch to coilovers. To start, the front air shocks are actually the easier parts to take out. One side was an OEM Mercedes shock and the other was an R0 unit. We went ahead and removed the air compressor and valve block, all the air lines, and the load leveling sensors, as for the time being we have no intention of going back. But all the connectors were preserved just in case. While removing the front shocks, most of the suspension components looked just fine, and considering the car only has 48,000 miles, I was expecting as much. But the front sway bar links did look pretty bad. We went ahead and ordered 2 new ones from Lemforder. These are about $18 to $19 depending on which side. Before I show you the rear strut and bellow removal, I want to go ahead and show you the BC coilovers for this car specifically. These are made for the E55, but they should work exactly the same for the CLS55. I opted to go with the BC coilovers just because of the cost and hearing pretty good stuff about them from people I know that are running them on other cars. I don't think I'll get more than 75,000 miles out of them, but at that point I think I'll move up to a KW V3 system anyway. If you're looking at the coilovers but don't know which one to get for the W211 E-Class, you'll want to make sure to get the model ending in J05, as those are made for the E55 AMG. As I mentioned before, the ones that are made for the E55 should work exactly the same for the CLS55. Moving on to the rear airmatic, there are a few things that are needed in addition to the coilover kit. For starters, rear lower control arms off of a non-airmatic W211 E-Class chassis are required to fit the spring from the coilovers. Also, the job cannot be done without a good set of Allen head sockets, Torx sockets, and XZN or triple square sockets. Loosening up the suspension was pretty rough as everything was tight and I don't have an impact currently. My brother, who was helping me, found that the exhaust would have to be removed to access some of the bolts as well. After a lot of wrenching and swearing, we finally got the rear lower control arm out, and with it the air bellows and struts. The lower control arm did take some wiggling before it would finally come all the way out, but with some finagling, nothing's impossible. Now it was time to install the coilovers in the rear. I wanted the drop to be modest, just because Houston has some bumpy roads and I don't want to rub if I ever use spacers or fit bigger wheels and tires. After setting the height, putting in the new spring and strut was actually much easier than removing the airmatic. Before fitting in the strut, my brother measured the distance from the fender to the ground after jacking up the new control arm, and measured the wheel too so that he could determine what height to set the strut so that it would have proper compression and rebound. We then went ahead and took our measurements and replicated our process on the other side. At this point, I wanted to go ahead and clean up the wheels and take a slight break from working on the car itself. The wheels were pretty dirty inside, but not too bad overall. My wife volunteered to rinse the wheels down lightly before I applied Adams Polish's iron remover. I then used a sponge to wipe off the majority of the dirt before rinsing the wheels off again. After that, I used Adams wheel cleaner and tire and rubber cleaner before moving on to using Adams car wash shampoo and a pressure washer. If you can't tell already, I'm a fan of Adams polishes, but I would say this process could be done easily with any other brand. Finally, I used a microfiber towel to dry the wheels off before we put them on the car for test fitment. While I do think I'm going to install aftermarket wheels later on, I have to profess my absolute love for these AMG wheels. I don't think manufacturers often get wheels right, but Mercedes nailed it with these, and I'm planning on keeping them on the car for a while. Now it's time to move on to the front shock installation. My brother wanted to go ahead and read up BC's literature to ensure he was setting everything up right. Meanwhile, I went ahead and sat around in front of the camera doing my best to look as good as the car behind me. I failed. Before we put the air shock in, we went ahead and removed the old sway bar links, which were super difficult to remove. The bolt that goes to the link has red Loctite, so it has to be heated up before it comes out. We only figured that out after busting our knuckles taking out the first one. Afterwards, I went ahead and fit the new shock in, and my brother locked in everything we had taken apart earlier. While the wheels were still off, we removed the rotors, cleaned and brushed off the wheel hubs, applied anti-seize to the hubs and shocks, and installed new Brembo rotors. The pads were still looking pretty new as the previous owner had recently replaced them. Finally, the car was ready to be lowered back down, and we took it out for a test drive around the neighborhood. After a minor hiccup involving a bolt we didn't tighten all the way through, the coilover installation was complete. The car handles much better, it's way flatter, and the ride is surprisingly comfortable. Alright, after finally getting to drive the car after nearly a month of it sitting in the garage, it was time to address the nasty fender damage. My brother had bent it in to test wheel fitment and so that we could at least drive, but honestly had flared out a bit more than here I could fix at home, and a body shop quoted us nearly $1,500 to replace and repaint, but I was able to find a good condition fender from another Iridium Silver CLS55 for just around $350, including tax and shipping. To start, we removed all the clips holding the side rocker panel so that we could access the bolts holding in the fender from the inside. Most of the bolts are in the engine bay, and there's one inside the car behind the door. My brother took measurements alongside the body panel so we knew how much space we had when installing the new fender. This way, the door wouldn't touch the fender when opened. We also removed the bumper to inspect the condition of our current heat exchanger and intercooler pump, both of which we plan on upgrading, but more on that in a later video. While the car was apart, we thought it would be a good time to take off those headlamps and clean off the nasty yellowing that had developed over the years. To clean the headlights up, we used Meguiar's plastics, which will run you about $7 at Walmart. I didn't think we would need to use sandpaper as there really wasn't any fogging, but I bought some anyway. However, I was right, and the plastics did a fantastic job cleaning up the yellowing and leaving behind an almost new clear look. The difference between the yellow headlamp assemblies and the now clean ones is night and day. Another thing we noticed about the headlights is the wiring inside was completely corroded. Plasticizers and German PVC wire insulation can sort of leave after a while, leaving behind a brittle, non-flexible insulation that breaks when it's finally removed and exposes wires and can cause shorting issues. We remedied this by buying new wire and completely redoing the internal headlamp harness. This did require us to bake the housings so that we can open them up. I'm also running Philips Diamond Vision H7 halogen bulbs as headlights and LED H7 CSP chip fog lights. Finally, we reinstalled the new fender using some zip ties as feeler gauges and the measurements from before. Then we put the bumper back on and the new headlights, and the car was ready to go. We took the car out for about a month and a half and drove it all over Houston to let the suspension settle in and to check alignment to see if there was any rubbing issues or anything else. After about 1,100 miles, I noticed nothing major was wrong and the car didn't rub or anything. It just kind of pulled to the right a little, so I had an alignment completed at Houston's very own Backyard Auto. Your car's alignment will more than likely go out of spec when lowered or when you install lowering springs or coilovers, so it's good practice to observe for a while which way it's going and then have it fixed. In the next video, I'll go over some more TLC as we refresh the transmission, give the car a tune-up, change some of the pulleys with Ultimate PD's units, and add in VRP's speeds, split cooling kit, and heat exchanger. Thank you guys for watching, and again, please make sure to like and subscribe, and be on the lookout for episode 2 of Code Project Car.